start. Hello, and thank you for joining us for the fifth and final webinar in a five-part series examining what role media policy can and should play in supporting a strong, sustainable, vibrant local media sector in the United States. My name is Damien Radcliffe, and I'm the Carolyn S. Chambers Professor of Journalism at the University of Oregon and the Knight News Innovation Fellow at the Tau Center for Digital Journalism, which is hosting this series of events. Over the last 4 months, we've heard from a number of expert panels exploring the current media policy landscape, lessons that can be learned from overseas markets, how grassroots and community media can have a seat at the table and be effectively supported, as well as fresh ideas for funding and structuring local news. Today, in our final discussion, we'll be looking at where media policy goes from here, particularly in light of a seemingly stalled legislative agenda on the Hill, the upcoming midterms, and upcoming elections happening at a state level across the country. To help us explore this topic, our panel today features 3 industry and academic experts. Joy Jenkins is an assistant professor at the School of Journalism and Electronic Media at the University of Tennessee. She's actually joining us today from Valencia, Spain, where it's very late at night, although probably about lunchtime in Spain. Dr. Jenkins' studies have focused on the influence of market concerns of journalists' public service roles, how perceptions of audience and local impact shape journalistic identity, and the role of the potential of journalistic narratives to spur civic engagement, and the many ways in which news organizations can use digital platforms to facilitate dialogue with audiences. Before moving to the University of Tennessee, Dr. Jenkins served as a postdoctoral research fellow in digital news at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University, where she studied how local and regional news organizations around Europe are adapting to changes facing the news industry. Elizabeth Hanson-Shapiro is a senior research fellow at the Tau Center for Digital Journalism. Dr. Hanson-Shapiro's work focuses on the future of journalism in public media and public policies to support local news. She's a steering committee member of the Working Group on Sustainability of Journalism at the Forum on Information and Democracy, and is the CEO and a co-founder of the National Trust for Local News, which is seeking to transform how local news organizations are funded, organized, owned, and operated. Previously, Dr. Hanson-Shapiro led the news sustainability research at the Schornstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and she was the research director for the Membership Puzzles Project's membership guide. Phil Napoli is the James R. Shepley Distinguished Professor of Public Policy at Duke University and the director of the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy at the Sanford School of Public Policy, also at Duke, where he's also the Senior Associate Dean for Faculty and Research. Dr. Napoli's research focuses on media institutions and media regulation and policy. He's provided formal and informal expert testimony on these topics to government bodies such as the US Senate, the FCC, the FTC, and Congressional Research Service. Professor Napoli is the author of 4 books, his most recent of which, Social Media and the Public Interest, Media Regulation in the Disinformation Age, was published by Columbia University Press in 2019. He's also published over 50 articles in legal, public policy, journalism, and communication journals, as well as over 30 invited book chapters in edited collections. Joy, Elizabeth, and Phil, thank you so much for joining us today. Just a quick reminder that there will be opportunities for interaction throughout, so please don't be shy about posting your comments and questions in the chat and using the Q&A function. Nick Matthews, my research assistant for this series and a former reporter and editor at the Houston Chronicle and the Daily Progress in Charlottesville, among other places, and now a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota, will keep an eye on your questions and will help us keep to time. So, hello everybody, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for everybody who is tuning in today. When we started this series, one of the reasons that we were really keen to hold this series of events was that it felt that there was a groundswell of support for media policy and potential initiatives to support local journalism that perhaps we hadn't previously seen here in the US. And now the landscape has started to shift a little bit. So the Local Journalism Act didn't make it. Then some of those efforts were weaved into Build Back Better, which looks like that's not going to make it. So I'm really curious to get a sense of where the land is lying right now, what types of media policy conversations you're seeing, and what's on the agenda with the media policymakers that you are talking to. Elizabeth, do you want to kick us off with this? What are the kind of conversations that you are seeing in your research work?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Damien, and it's a pleasure to be here and have this really important discussion. Totally agree that the energy and excitement around the Local Journalism Sustainability Act and then Build Back Better, it was really invigorating. A lot of these policy ideas felt like they were just ideas that we've been kicking around in some cases forever. And so it was just really gratifying to see all of it, get into legislative language. And I give a lot of credit to the Rebuild Local News Coalition and Steve Waldman for really pushing that forward. It really does seem like with Build Back Better, this round has closed. And I think everybody involved in that conversation knew that that was a possibility, that the political window would shut and, we'd have to sort of rebuild for the next cycle. I'll say where some of the media policy conversations that I'm having have restarted is around platform transparency and data access for researchers and journalists. I think some of that is also timely and important given that we have midterms coming up, and there's just a general concern about the sort of polluted information around elections. So, I'm hearing less of the sustainability at the federal level and more on the kind of platform data transparency piece, which is also, I think, really critical to journalists and newsrooms. But it feels like that federal conversation has closed. And that said, and we can talk more about this, there is still a lot of interesting innovation happening out there at the state and municipal levels. And the, community newspapers that I increasingly work with, many of them are sustained by legal notice, public notice revenue, and those are obviously longstanding and in some cases continuing conversations in state houses about how to keep those revenue streams alive. So there are, there are policies happening and policy discussions happening, even if at the kind of marquee federal level, a lot of that has fallen off for now.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That's really helpful to understand. And I know we will dive into some of the state level opportunities that we're seeing exploring, but it also sounds a little bit as if this sort of rebuilding for the next cycle that you're talking about, how the conversation to some extent has already moved on and is looking at kind of different areas of focus. Is that a fair summary?
I think that the stakeholders who were mobilized to have those sustainability conversations are definitely still having them, but we're all seeing this sort of choke point at this moment in Congress. So I don't, my sense is that the coalitions that were built are still intact. It's just that there's not a clear kind of path to any sort of forward progress.
That makes sense. Phil, what's your take? What are the conversations that you're seeing and involved in?
One thing is, to follow on what Elizabeth was saying about how cyclical this might be. It's interesting that right now the Government Accountability Office is in the process of researching a report to Congress on this topic. Is it too little too late, or does this help jumpstart something new? I guess that will remain to be seen. Depends on what the substance of the report is and how, whether it motivates anybody. But that it's interesting on the federal level. At least that is something that is ongoing, and we I'll be curious to see if that gains any meaningful traction. The other thing that's interesting to think about on the federal level is how soon that the Federal Communications Commission could potentially actually be remade a bit in terms of actually having a full slate of commissioners. A vote is coming on G.G. Sohn's appointment to the commission, and there's been a vacancy at the FCC for a while that has kept it deadlocked. So could that, after so long, a change in the composition of the FCC commissioners potentially restart some of the potential paths of action that have been dormant at the FCC for so long? It's just so interesting when I think about how I got involved in this work. It was all due to it was all in the aftermath of the FCC's gosh, I'm forgetting the name of it now, Future of Media report from back in 2011 or whatever that was. And then their subsequent community information needs research that they commissioned in 2012 and 2013. And, which, again, was super frustrating at that point in time, because the nature of the recommendations that came out of a lot of that work were so, minimal. Broadcasters should make their public inspection files available online. Like, that these are the kind of conclusions that came at the end of a 400-page report. Was incredibly frustrating. So I mean, but it's interesting again to think about the composition of the commission finally taking a shape that it hasn't in quite some time. And so whether that goes into the direction of ownership or localism focused possible regulatory interventions, we'll see.
I'm so glad you mentioned those two previous reports, which are almost a decade old now,
Yeah.
Phil, because I was reminded of that through an interview that you gave that I'll post a link to in the chat. But it feels like those kind of big pieces of work, which provided a kind of very rich body of evidence, we haven't really seen an equivalent from the FCC or at a kind of national level since. Do you think that if we see a change in makeup along the lines that you described, that we will start to see that evidence base being captured, or do we already know all of this? And actually, all that would just do is kick the can down the road. Actually, the time is, we have more than enough data. We actually need action.
Well, it's funny. I mean, you're echoing one of the conversations I have every once in a while with one of the funders I work with, which is, do we really need to document the harms still? Is there anybody who's not aware at this point of the nature and the scope and the consequences of this situation? You'd like to think that the answer to that is no. So I'm very interested in the notion of a research agenda shifting a bit at this point towards trying to identify what are the characteristics of successful solutions. What are the generalizable lessons that we can take from successful examples that are out there? What is building a true strategy for reversing some of these trends look like?
Well,
can I just add,
yeah, please.
Can I just add there, Phil? I think I completely agree with you that like within the industry and academics who study this stuff and funders who fund us studying this stuff, like there's a known fact base. I think what's going to be interesting about the GAO report, and also, like Massachusetts has a state level commission to study the effect of news deserts, is whether that'll be another axis for catalyzing public conversation and public concern about this, because I oftentimes think that we are talking to ourselves, and the Pew survey that said that most Americans don't understand the financial crisis that local news is in. Like there's something hasn't quite broken through yet. And, a GAO report or even a Massachusetts, a state level commission might not be the right vehicle. But I do wonder if yes, we're moving to solutions conversation in the industry, but we're also moving to a problem marketing stage nationally. That's going to be really necessary.
Those are great points. And I hope that in our short conversation that we'll be having today, we will be able to focus mostly on solutions and how we can try and move forward. But I agree also, Elizabeth, you were saying, we have a huge issue in terms of bringing the public along on this journey. That data from a few years ago I think it was 71% of Americans saying they felt that local news was doing well financially, when we all know that the truth is very different. I do wonder if the pandemic might have helped to start to shift some of those perceptions, in that I've seen, because when advertising fell through the floor, I've seen a lot of local news outlets being much more willing to make an ask for direct support and why that matters and why journalism matters, in a way that perhaps they felt a little bit uncomfortable with before. Joy, I'm curious from your research working more directly with journalists, to what extent are you seeing journalists having these conversations about the future of their industry, and indeed a willingness to share that with their audiences?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely an interest and a willingness there to share that with their audience. And as you mentioned, with the pandemic, I saw with the journalists I talked with in the UK and around Europe, and a few here in the US, that they were making those asks and reminding their readers who would come to them, in record numbers in some cases in those early months of the pandemic, that remember the service that we offered you as we go back to needing your support, needing your financial support. So certainly saw that. And yeah, and what I found in talking with journalists, in these different countries, is that they do refer to media policy and conversations about government intervention and other types of things. A lot of those conversations are frustrations about who is at the table and who's not, and who's involved in those conversations. We've seen that in some of the previous panels in this series. Some real concerns about who's part of those conversations and developing solutions. But in particular, they're really keen to talk to researchers and to share their experiences. A lot of the outlets I reached out to said that maybe it was the first time they were participating in a research study or doing anything like that. And they were very candid, very transparent, very open to talk about the challenges of the business model, the challenges of recruiting and retaining young journalists, of getting young audiences, of their interest in connecting with underserved and marginalized communities. And we're very open about that, and also about the barriers they face in terms of resources to do that type of work. And so I found that there's a recognition that a lot of these models are broken, and they want to contribute to fixing them, and they want to be involved in innovative efforts, and be able to do things differently and kind of reclaim what local news is supposed to be about. And so I think the interest is there. It's just figuring out how to effectively and productively bring them into these conversations in a way that is going to be helpful to them in the end.
Well, and I'm curious as part of that as to whether, as researchers, we're doing a good enough job in terms of both engaging people to find out what's happening at the ground, but also to kind of share some of these policy discussions, and how perhaps we might be able to do that better to help that public discourse. I'd love to kind of get some thoughts on that from each or any of you on that particular area. Feel free to chip in whatever order. It's a kind of a broad question, but
yeah,
what can we do?
I think it's a great insight, and I think part of it is that there haven't traditionally been those clear pathways. I mean, I guess the Rebuild Local News Coalition was sort of one attempt to get industry stakeholders, but a lot of those stakeholders are really intermediaries. Journalists, it's on the one hand, it's kind of tricky, because journalists, the value of objectivity, even as it's come under scrutiny, I think is still really baked deep into the profession. And so advocacy on the policy front, just like advocacy on the sustainability front, I think can feel scary, and like it breaks some editorial or professional norms. So I think it's a really good question you're asking, and I'm not sure that I can actually point easily to examples of where that's working well currently, but I'm curious for others' thoughts on that.
Yeah. Phil, do you want to add anything?
I didn't catch this first part of the question.
Sure. It was more just around, I'm curious as to what role we can be doing as researchers in this space to support journalists in terms of helping them to, giving them the evidence base, or helping them to air these issues with their audience. But also, the other part of that is to what extent are we bringing in a diversity of voices into our own research, and giving a breadth of journalistic outlets a seat at the table, so that our evidence base is informed by a cross section of the media ecosystem, rather than perhaps those who are most prominent or shout the loudest.
Gotcha. I mean, I think the more, what I'm seeing more of in terms of those types of collaborations are researchers helping at the, sort of in ways that we haven't seen when the news industry was healthy, and they didn't need to give a crap what we had to offer as researchers, truthfully. Less on the sort of evidence advocacy front, because actually one of the things I think has been interesting about journalists, I hate to sort of make this generalization, but as a whole, journalists were very late to embrace, at all, which many of them still don't, the idea that, some sort of model that involves greater public support is a path worth pursuing. Journalists and editors, they've been the slowest to sort of give up on sort of what is, we're seeing as a real, pessimistic future for at least the traditional business models. But what I'm seeing a lot of, and we've have noticed that we've had opportunities to engage in, are the kinds of sort of research collaborations about how to help cultivate and learn about the audience at the local level. What are their needs and interests, so that the news content can be better oriented towards meeting those needs, right? Being that kind of partner in the exploration of alternative paths forward. And those are, those have proven useful, at least in the experiences I've had with those, from what, the feedback we've gotten.
Well, and I think one of the things that's really interesting is that meeting those needs may look very different from the way in which local news and information has traditionally been served, and that's been one of the ideas that has kind of come up through this series, of the kind of the importance of kind of different channels of communicating. So the kind of Where by Us model of newsletters, the WhatsApp groups that we see to meet often with diaspora communities or communities for whom English is not a first language. And I'm curious to find out a little bit more about what some of those models look like, and indeed whether policymakers and politicians understand that this is local news, this is local journalism, or whether they are clinging on to a definition that perhaps is somewhat redundant. Joy, shall we come to you perhaps on that first?
Yeah, so I mean, it made me think of a project I've been working on with a colleague, Eileen Cabas-Maharas. We've been doing a case study of the neighborhood news service in Milwaukee, which is housed at Marquette and has, various kind of funding streams. But the whole idea is to be, absolutely community first, and to serve neighborhoods that have been underserved or ignored or stereotyped by other news outlets, and completely shifting their editorial model, not to think about the way that local news has been traditionally been delivered or formatted, but figure out, what do our readers need now? What questions can we answer for them? And just really opening that dialogue and providing that. And, when you look at the stories they're producing and the initiatives they're engaging with, they may not look like, the local news some may be used to, or policymakers or politicians, but it is absolutely created to serve those communities. And so being able to broaden that definition and, really consider what do these different types of outlets look like? How can we kind of open that definition and open those boundaries? And I've even seen, in the UK and, some of the research there, the Bureau Local is a really innovative collaborative approach to doing, local journalism. And they do stage shows where the journalists, come on and answer questions from the audience. And they work with neighborhood activists and academics and data scientists, and just thinking differently about who's involved in the work of journalism. And in a lot of these are trends that have been going on for a while. And so ensuring that that's all clear to the people making these decisions, and they know how diverse this landscape really is.
What's so interesting to me as I looked at the legislation, the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, and then what got pulled into Build Back Better, definitions are always difficult in the context of policymaking, and I actually think they did a pretty good job. I mean, there's language in there like newspaper and publisher, but the definition of local, I think, is primary content of a publication is derived from primary sources relating to news and current events. It serves a regional or a geographic community. You could start to see how those would be the building blocks of more of policies that don't need to reference like newspaper or publisher in order to direct support to local media projects. So, I think that's progress, even if like the overall frame in this round was like newspapers. Right,
and alongside that, there's also a question we've had alluded to, well, very clearly referenced in the chat from Mildred Perot. Mildred, I hope I pronounced your surname correctly. But you ask about, well, you might point out there are multiple models here, but also you ask this question of, well, what does success look like? So Phil, you've obviously done a lot of work researching the information needs of communities. How do we measure what success looks like and that they are being met?
That's a great question. That's what I'm going to be, right up front. I don't think I have an answer, but the type, I think about this sort of a variety of possible answers, right? How we break down sort of quantifying this, so to speak. On the one hand, we could focus on how the nature of sort of the journalistic output in a community evolves over time, right? Do we see, we feel pretty good about at this point that we've developed some reasonably reliable and agreed upon and sort of robust metrics of the health of local journalism. But at the same time, we've also come to realize that it's one thing to assess what's being produced and, does success, do we need to take into account consumption and impact and those sort of things? Where do we, there's just a few different levels at which we could, target for truly trying to understand success. Do we want to see measurable connections with changes in political participation or especially at this moment, right? Political knowledge. If we were to see journalistic output change in all the positive ways we hope for it to change in a community, but see no, corresponding changes in political knowledge, let's say, or civic engagement, that would obviously be frustrating because again, we operate under some of those assumptions about those relationships, but I think a lot of what, over the past few years, we also probably need to, take a hard look at some of those.
Right, and absolutely, and as part of that, one of the themes that's also come up has been the fact that certain communities, particularly communities of color, but also rural communities, have historically been underserved by local news, and that we're seeing kind of multiple levels of information deprivation there that go back a very long way. And the idea being posited by Jessica Gonzalez last week, by Tracy Powell in December, and others, of this is an opportunity to revisit and address those kind of historical issues. That's been clearly a topic that has exercised a number of our panelists. I'm curious as to whether the conversations you're having with policymakers, whether that is on their agenda and radar. Are they looking to build something that is better, or are we just merely kind of putting our finger in the dike and trying to preserve the status quo?
I think there's always, there's always entrenched interests in any policy discussion, and any well-organized industry has their approaches and relationships. So, like, of course, at a certain level, the answer is yes, but I feel like there has been progress in starting to think about what some of those policy solutions might be like, not necessarily at the federal level, but at the, at the municipal level. Like, you had Graciela Martovsky on, and she talked about the great work that, the Center for Community Media did, documenting the massive success of New York City's municipal advertising for ethnic media outlets initiative. So, it's those kinds of demonstrations of what's possible in supporting media for underserved communities that I think starts to point the way to this. But I think, I think there's another aspect to this, which is that the substantiating impact and the so what of a healthy news and information ecosystem, and this question of how do you serve underserved communities with higher quality news and information, to me those are actually related questions, because if we can't say what good information or a healthy information ecosystem does and what it's good for, then it's very hard to figure out how you make progress on really rebuilding or really making the case that there should be any resources at all directed towards any of these issues. So in my mind, that question of impact and what does success look like really has to go hand in hand with this task of getting more and better information to underserved communities.
And Elizabeth, do you think we have the answer to that question?
No, I don't even think. No, I don't even think we've begun to make progress on this. I mean, I can talk a little bit about my work at the trust, but we are part of what we're doing is starting to have conversations with impact investors, trying to convince them to bring resources into the space. But impact investors want impact, and an impact in news is not just like, oh, we have, news outlets that operate at sustainability. It's like, that's table stakes. The questions that we really need to answer are like, so what? I think, Philly, you were saying this as well. So, and I don't think we really have we have intuitions and we have values and we have hopes and dreams, but I don't think we have like causal mechanisms between healthy news and information and political knowledge or civic action, at least that I've come across.
Right. Phil, you were going to say something about this in terms of the policymakers kind of their willingness or not to embrace the opportunity to do things differently and kind of build back a different system rather than just simply try to turn back the clock to the way things were.
I was just going to say, and this is just casual observation, and maybe wrong, but I don't know if I've seen the kind of nuanced conversations and sophisticated thinking about what a reconfigured local news ecosystem can look like. I don't think, and that's the kind of thing I would love to see if this GAO report really helps to do. I don't think policymakers yet there are very few of them have that kind of robust and very current and contemporary understanding of the ways the alternatives that are out there. There's nothing. I mean, I remember years ago, and it should have been a long time ago, but it wasn't all that long ago, in doing research on political advertising and going to consulting firms as part of the interviews I was conducting, these media buying firms, and asking the basic question, which is, why do politicians advertise on broadcast television when that's such a waste of money that they're reaching people who can't even vote for them? Why are you putting ads on New York TV stations when you're running for governor of New Jersey? And the answer I got was, well, they just kind of like to see themselves on TV. The point being, and I don't think that that hasn't changed to some extent, which is there are always a few iterations behind, unfortunately. And I think I would hate to say it, but I think that might be the case here, still.
Yeah, well, it sounds, Joy, as if this is an opportunity for researchers to actually be able to map not just what success could look like, but also what this model could look like. Is that a conversation that you have seen starting to take place in the US or indeed in Europe, where of course there's historically been a much greater willingness for market intervention?
Sorry, can you repeat what?
Yeah, no, I was just saying that I think one of the things that Elizabeth and Phil's comments throw up for me is the fact that I think this is an opportunity for researchers to help to reimagine what the local news landscape could look like, and to be slightly more visionary rather than telling us the story of here's where we are today. Let's look at how we could move to a more inclusive and sustainable future. Is that a conversation that you are seeing both journalists having, but also researchers having in the US and Europe? And I think the European perspective I mentioned just because I think there's a much greater willingness in Europe for market intervention than we have historically seen here in the US, although I do feel as if the sands are starting to shift a little bit in the States.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to look at solutions and to look at what success looks like, and to really explore some new types of approaches and innovative types of models. I've been doing some research on collaboration and models of collaboration that specifically engage with local outlets, and of course building on work by Sarah Stonebelly and Heather Bryant and others who've been looking in this space. And there's lots of different. We look specifically at the European context, but some models that are emerging there that really take on a range of different type of kind of business model approaches. So some that are more nonprofit driven and rely on journalists to volunteer to engage in investigative work in a collaborative way. Some that are still, very focused on the commercial model, but thinking differently about the players involved. We looked at a project in Italy that involved a big legacy publisher and a couple of data journalism startups that worked together to do their work, and then also just kind of the classic news agency and thinking about how those can be effective. And so thinking about expansion and collaboration and cooperation, and what are some ways that some of these interventions and policies and nonprofits and grants can help support thinking kind of bigger and broader about how journalists and outlets can work together to maximize their resources.
Well, and a lot of that feels like it's very new to the industry. I mean, the concepts of collaboration in a kind of very competitive, historically landscape, still quite hard for a lot of newsrooms to do. It was really interesting last week hearing Sue Cross talking about the emergence of non-profit models and a greater willingness to accept that. And indeed, my own research has shown a lot of journalists saying they feel that the commercial model for local journalism is kind of dead in the States. And I'm really curious. I'm seeing some nodding. I mean, this might be a very short answer to a slightly longer question, but as to whether, is that right? Is the commercial model dead, do you think? Elizabeth, let's come to you first, and then we'll come to Phil and Joy. I'm just curious for your perspectives on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the commercial model actually covers a bunch of different dimensions of the way that capital and profit making work together. I would say, I think the corporate ownership model is on its last legs. I think we've seen a really high degree of consolidation. I think we can get a little bit further, frighteningly, on that dimension. But the small and mid-sized publishers that I work with at the Trust, many of them ran successful commercial businesses, want to exit, but it's pretty clear that there could be a sustainable future, but there's not necessarily going to be a profit-making future. So the question is, how do you transition the capital structure and the governance and ownership so that sustainability is possible? And to the extent that you do get net returns, they can go back into the business, but you're not setting up any small or large owners to expect huge returns, because it's just clear that that era is coming to an end. Like, the digital economics are just very different than the print product economics. So, I think that commercial models, very small scale commercial models, may be possible in digital, or maybe like highly networked, but I think the commercial model is going to be edge cases. And I think, what we're seeing is a sort of decapitalization of the space on the ownership and governance side. And that's obviously what we're trying to work with at the Trust. But I think it's just, it's going to be a matter of time, whether it's us or others in this space who kind of finally make that structural shift. But that's what we're in the midst of, from my perspective.
Phil, do you agree with that? That this
I was gonna layer onto that. We think about all the different components of what we might call the commercial model, and in addition, I think to the corporate component of that being done, I think the ad support model dimension of this is pretty much done. I think we can imagine, and we're seeing this with with different types of membership models and things like that. I think there's still some sort of version of a future in which consumer payment plays a role. I think that's actually important, that that the product not be devalued to the point, but is there some version of that going forward that's also capable of addressing some of the inequities that are inherent in that model, right? And I think that's one of the interesting things about membership models and things like that, one's newspaper subscription never came on any kind of sliding scale, right? Based on your ability to pay. And so the way that, just that kind of innovation can be very, a valuable way, for that aspect of the commercial model to stay viable going forward.
Well, it's really interesting when you look at membership models in some other parts of the world, in, say, developing economies. there is kind of both that kind of sliding scale, or often a sort of willingness to pay, so you can contribute as much or as little as you like, and you're not it's not a gated community where capital is the access point to these different tiers. And I would like to see us thinking a little bit differently about some of those things. And it goes back to some of the notions that Simon Galper has talked a little bit about in terms of thinking about news and information as a public utility, that utilities often have low income tariffs and kind of other methods of access. And we're not really seeing that conversation in this space, but there are transferable lessons. Elizabeth, you had that great phrase about making sustainability possible, and we said early on we should focus on solutions. So what are some of the things that we have seen? Phil's given a few examples there, but what are some of the potential interventions or kind of other opportunities to help engender sustainability that we're seeing? Joy, could you give us some examples of some of the things that you've seen in your work, and then we'll hear about Elizabeth and the trust and come back to Phil.
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of building on the last point, this, reader payment model and reader payment emphasis, definitely really prominent, and seeing a lot of conversations about that. Some enthusiasm and excitement around it, at least with some of the journalists I've talked to, that it is giving them a chance to kind of reconnect and be transparent and explain to their readers, why they are, serving a public good and how they're serving them, and just helping them understand better why investing in local journalism is really important. But there's also these kind of divisions emerging, where I heard journalists and managers saying things like, well, we have the loyal readers and we have the flyby readers, and the flyby readers are coming via platforms, and they're not going to be the ones we're really going to focus on investing in, because they're never going to be willing to pay or subscribe. So of course that raises questions over who are you losing, who's not having access, and who are we prioritizing in terms of those audiences. But I've also seen some, talk about having lower rates for younger readers, for example, or for students. And of course, a lot of outlets lifted paywalls during those early months of the pandemic. So this recognition that it's not, a one and done strategy, that, it has to evolve and really consider how to serve the broadest possible audience. But a lot of interesting kind of conversations and questions as that pivot to paid really, takes hold.
I certainly see with my students, many of them benefit from student subscription prices to big publications, but then the moment they graduate, and this has been a conversation that was been kicking around journalism Twitter over the last couple of days, but the moment they graduate to not a high-paying job, they're expected to be paying kind of full whack. There's no kind of graduated increase in subscription prices and so forth. So there's definitely scope for innovation and flexibility to be built into that. Elizabeth, what are some of the things that you are seeing working through your work at the Trust, and what are some of the things that you are advocating for to help create a more sustainable future?
Yeah, so just building on what Joy said, I mean, I think we have a pretty good evidence base now for what sustainability at the business model can look like, and what practices are around reader revenue, around membership, around subscriptions, like kind of what works for a mix. And, a lot of those models now are kind of hybrid, philanthropically supported, and advertising and reader revenue. It's kind of like and events, like an and. So I'd say at that business model level, there's a lot of success there that can be built on. Where the trust is intervening is really at that ownership, capital structure, and governance level, because ultimately you want to have a group of owners, either in a nonprofit or in like a public benefit corporation, that have the proper expectations for what the business model can produce over what time period and what resources are required. And so I think that's the kind of next frontier of creating a new sustainable structure. And, the American Journalism Project does this through creating new nonprofits. There's many different kind of tools in the toolbox, but I think it's that realignment of ownership and mission and governance with business model that's really gonna get us to the next stage of sustainability.
Thank you. And Phil, you've commented a lot on media ownership in the past. So I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that. And then we should, of course, also talk about some of the historic forms of support that we have also always seen for journalism, which tends to perhaps sometimes be overlooked?
I don't have much on comment on the media ownership issue, other than I just so remember so vividly, whether this was 10 or 15 years ago, sort of attitudes within the FCC, which were, hey, consolidation, that it's a necessary means to an end now for journalism survival, right? And suddenly it was, we don't have the luxury of caring about how that, about whether we're seeing more consolidation, and combined with that, of course, the idea that that the digital space, providing this sort of safety outlet anyway, right? That, in terms of the low barriers to entry that are there. And I think we can look back now and really realize that, all of those assumptions were flawed.
Well, and it's interesting that it feels almost as if the opposite is true now. That certainly we've seen through this series a lot of conversation about, well, how do we let 1,000 flowers bloom, rather than just to have a smaller, an increasingly smaller number of entities controlling our news agenda and access to news. What are some of the ideas that you see working, Phil, that you would like to see amplified or perhaps enhanced?
I'm not the best. Oh, and just so you guys know, it looks like my my connection's getting funky. So if I'm suddenly gone, that's what's going on. I'm not as on the ground as these other guys are, as far as what local initiatives are working and not working. But I mean, one of the things I'd of course point to on the policy front is what we saw happen in New Jersey, right, where we actually saw, and again, it didn't proceed in the ideal way, but where we actually saw public funds from the auction of broadcast spectrum go to supporting local journalism collaboratives. That love to see more of that happen.
Yeah, Elizabeth, could you say a little bit more about that? You're much closer to this than some of the conversations that are happening at a state level.
Yeah. So what the structure that we set up in Colorado, the Colorado News Conservancy, was designed to acquire and transform small and mid-sized papers that would otherwise sort of get rolled up into bigger conglomerates or just shut for lack of new owners and new financing. So, I feel like this is our innovation in governance and capital to try to restructure the field. And I think, what we're learning is what I think collaboratives are learning in other places, that kind of resource sharing and bringing together journalists and newsrooms under a common entity really does work. I would say the advantage of something like a conservancy structure, whether a nonprofit or public benefit corporation, is that you get that shared decision-making and governance and ownership. I think some of what we've seen in collaboratives that are based on a kind of coalition of the willing is that it really depends on which partners are at the table, how nice folks are going to play with each other, how resources get divided. So, I would say where it's working in collaboratives, it's where people really have a strong frame and some leadership and willingness and ability to work together. We're doing the organizational piece of that, which is that there's governance and ownership in addition to just like a coalition of different partners. So I think that has a lot of positive potential. I would also say, as with my like kind of public media researcher hat on, I think there are a lot of public stations that are doing some really interesting kind of coalitional resource sharing collaboration, both amongst each other in networks, but then also increasingly with other types of newsrooms in their area. So like, WFAE in Charlotte, for example, is like a big piece of the solutions journalism collaborative there. And I think there's other examples around the country of public media stations kind of taking on a leadership role. So I think that's another promising sort of nascent in some ways, but growing solution. And I think, we're going to have to see more of that, because as the overall amount of resources shrinks, but the need for local reporting capacity grows, some of that's going to have to get done through these networks and collaborations.
Right, and of course those types of collaboratives that you enjoy also talked about. A lot of that is rooted in sharing resources for reporting and for news and information, but we shouldn't forget that has potential also on the business side, on the financial side as well, in terms of we've seen, sadly, a lot of sort of failed local ad consortiums, but there are other examples like the local media consortium and others where you can have collective ad buys across kind of multiple outlets, which potentially I think has a lot of possibilities for kind of smaller players who would be unable to access kind of funding from like large national advertisers, but when they're part of a cooperative or that kind of collaborative model, it opens up different financial possibilities for them. Joy, could you just briefly touch on, you mentioned some of the work you've been doing on collaborative research, on collaborative work. What are some of the hardest things that newsrooms or news organizations are finding in terms of collaboration, and how can they overcome them?
I mean, of course, the biggest one is just, minimizing that competitive spirit or figuring out, how to get everybody on the same page and under the same mission. I think that at least the collaboratives I've looked at, there was a strong desire to be involved, to learn, to share resources. In particular, a big emphasis on data journalism and contributing to data sets and learning how to use it, and to, have the training and access to a network of people to ask questions about that. And then, the biggest challenges are to ensure that everybody has a voice in what's happening, that it's not all kind of top-down decision-making in terms of what's being investigated and how it's going to be done, that everybody has a seat at the table, a willingness to be able to publish and have shared deadlines, and, recognize that releasing all the stories on a particular topic at a given time is going to have, a big impact and can lead to conversations, and figuring out just what types of organizational models and structures are going to work best, whether to keep it looser or, to have a more kind of stringent structure. And then, one of the Bureau Local that I mentioned before is focused on, grants and donations. And so figuring out how to make that sustainable, because that has been incredibly successful, massive network of journalists involved, but can be kind of year to year, in terms of ensuring that continues. And so still a lot of questions, but I think, at least in the research I was doing, some really early success stories and journalists feeling really emboldened that they were learning and, having better work as a result of those opportunities to work with other people. And I think seeing a lot of potential in what that could become.
Thank you. It's great to see that those conversations and kind of perhaps a shift in recognition of the fact that you're not necessarily in competition with your peers, or you shouldn't be, that we do need to kind of work more collaboratively and collectively. And we only have a short bit of time left. I have two final questions that I want to touch on. I mean, one of which was something I alluded to in the introduction, which is really my fear that the momentum that we have seen over the last sort of year or so in the media policy space risks evaporating over the course of the next year if we see changes on the Hill and potentially what might happen in 2024. So, my question for each of you is, how do we maintain the momentum, the positive discussions that we have seen, and indeed the positive examples that we're starting to see, particularly at a state level? What can we do to keep our foot to the floor here? Phil, can I come to you first, and then I'll come to Elizabeth and Joy?
Sure. And, this might be, a very provincial answer, which is, I think research that continues, to document the consequences of not paying attention to this issue, but that also sort of makes clear in some sort of comparative way, right? Like, look, this is how communities benefit. I think, the more that this could be framed in that way, and what are these tangible benefits that communities, receive when their local ecosystem, news ecosystem is healthy and robust. And so I think that's our role as researchers, to keep injecting where we find it in the work that we do, assuming, maybe we don't find it, but if we do, we need to be really good about making sure everyone who needs to know that learns about it.
Great. Elizabeth, let's come to you next.
Yeah, I would definitely underscore what Phil said. I think documenting the positive effects, and positive effects are not sustainability. It's the so what of the journalism that's supported by the sustainability. I think that will definitely help to build an even stronger case. And then, part of me is also like, let's just lean in at the state level. Colorado just introduced a bill that took actually provisions of the Local Journalism Sustainability Act around the tax credit for subscriptions and local advertising credit. That's in this session. So, and that's great. So, we could also get a whole host of interesting state level interventions, even if it feels like the kind of federal intervention is further away. So I think that's an important place to keep the work going.
Well, and when Phil said provincial earlier, I actually don't mind provincial as part of the answer to this, because I think we may well be that there is no one size fits all kind of national level response to this, and that actually we need kind of bottom up solutions.
I'm provincial from the standpoint of me as a researcher advocating, hey, we need more research. Yes. That's a big cliche, I know.
That's true. Joy, what's your take on this? How do we maintain this momentum? Do you agree with your fellow panelists?
Yeah, no, absolutely agree with that, showing the tangible effects and that, so what factor, and ensuring that's completely clear to those in the industry and to citizens as well. Of course, as researchers, it's continuing to emphasize this very public-facing approach to getting our work out. So it's not just having conversations among academics, but presenting it in ways, whether it's reports or, predictions or events or focus groups or whatever it is. So that we are, working alongside the people we're hoping to help and making our research available and accessible to them. I think also just, at universities, getting our students involved in this, reinforcing to them how valuable local journalism is, ensuring there are pipelines for them to seek out jobs that they can get in and stay in the local news sector. I know this was highlighted in the first panel in this series, and really having that conversation. And there's some interesting initiatives at University of Kansas and University of Georgia, where they've brought, a local paper, created an entire local outlet, within a university program. And so thinking about how to engage our students in this work and get them excited so they'll continue the conversation too.
Yeah. And then lastly, I'd like to end on a note of optimism if we can. And so I just ask each of you to just very quickly give us a sense of either what's most exciting you in this space right now, or what do you see as a possibility in this space, where perhaps there's an idea that's not being fully explored, but you think there is potential and that could be a game changer. So what's exciting you about either what's happening now or that you think could happen in the future? Joy, should we come to you first on that? A tough question to ask at the end. I appreciate it.
I think just the diversity of things going on. So of course we see all these headlines calling for, the death knell of local news, but then when you actually get into it and you talk to people who are working and researching and who have efforts in this area, there are so many fantastic ideas and such an emphasis on serving communities that have been left out and such potential to involve them in the conversation. I would say too, really thinking broadly about, local journalism and what it is. Things like I've been doing some work in alternative news weeklies with a colleague, with Kelsey Whipple, and that's a whole other area of cultural journalism that is very much at stake of being lost. And so I think there's potential to involve even more players in this and to think, really broadly about what local journalism looks like, and that's happening, and it's been really exciting to see.
Thank you, Joy. Phil?
Probably, I think it pops immediately to mind something maybe we briefly referenced, but should at least be very explicit about, which is the growth in philanthropic commitment and attention in this area. I've been doing this long enough that I've been part of these various initiatives over the years to sort of pitch and sell different foundations on that this sort of is the kind of thing that does fall within their their mandate, whether a community health foundation was being persuaded to think about community health to include the information health of a community, and so to see that resonate more and, sort of an upward trajectory in how this issue is resonating in the philanthropic community is something we should call out.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Phil. Elizabeth, the final word to you.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything my distinguished panelists have shared. I think the exciting possibility in my mind, and it relates to the funding and the diversity of models, is that we'll really start to build new institutions at the ecosystem level. We've had everyone on their own bottom for a really long time. And I think all the experimentation and work on collaboration, my hope is that these really become more durable, long-lasting structures supported most likely in many places by philanthropy. But I think that's really going to be what helps make some of these experiments longer lasting. I think that's a very exciting possibility.
And just to follow on the philanthropy front, to see how they're approaching it in many times in the way that we would hope, with attention to issues of inequities that have characterized the old model, and sort of decentralizing decision making and allowing a lot of the real work to happen at the community level. It's nice to see that sort of attention to those details.
Yeah, great. And it's also nice to end on something positive, because there's always a risk of a sort of slightly doom and gloom narrative when we talk about this topic. But as we've seen today, there is a lot of interesting things going on, and we hope that we can maintain that momentum. Thanks to the three expert panelists who joined us today, Joy Jenkins, Elizabeth Hanson-Shapiro, and Phil Napoli. And thank you to all of you, for watching. This is the last in a 5-part series made possible. Thank you to Emily Bell, Pete Brown, Hannah Joy, and Nick Matthews at the TAL Centre for their support for this series. All of our previous recordings, and indeed this one, will be available on TAL's YouTube and SoundCloud channels. This recording should go up in the next 24 to 48 hours. You can see the archive of 4 previous talks, and do keep an eye on TAL's excellent weekly newsletter, which will include a summary of our discussion today. In the meantime, thanks again to our panelists for joining us today, and to all of our guest speakers over the past few months, and again to everyone who's tuned in to watch these discussions.